The cart jolted. The archivist heard the iron teeth of the cage scrape over cobbles, and a voice from inside, Marin, chunked a single raw sound into the dusk. Shame tightened the archivist's ribs. He kept his hands on the ledger and did not look away. The city square smelled of wet straw and old torches. Officials signaled, and the cart stopped at the magistrate's dais. The punishment would be made public now. He had been cataloguing municipal orders for 34 years. The archivist stood with his spectacles on a chain and the leather ledger under his arm while the crowd pressed forward like a living wall. He recorded the cart's arrival in Shorthorn Cage, Marin dusk. His fingers were ink-stained. The ledger's page was open to a list of names with dates and marginal notes. He glanced at the marks. The ledger read like a map of shame, who to display, when, for how long. That concrete list is what made the ritual an instrument of policy rather than a one-time spectacle. The magistrate climbed the dais and spoke with a clipped voice. By municipal order, the magistrate, this cage will stand 3 nights and 2 days. Let it be a lesson. The herald beat his staff against the stone. Hear ye. The herald intoned. Voices moved among the crowd. The archivist set a line in the ledger. Decree read aloud. Witness signatures pending. He watched 2 burly guards haul Marin from the cart. Marin's shoulder scraped the iron. The archivist felt a shift from shame into a low, rising anger that made him tap his pen harder. Behind the dais, the executioner and chamberlain argued over the straps and the placement of the iron collar. It should bite in wood. The executioner, no. The chamberlain replied, we show, not maim. The mark must be visible but not fatal. Their voices were low and practical, like men discussing measurements. The archivist moved closer to label the debate in his notes. He wrote the strap measurements and the condition of Marin's ankles. The ledger took those exact numbers and reduced the human to data. Strap width, collar dent, time of display. A woman forced through the crowd and collapsed against the platform rail. Elia, she said, naming herself with a single breath. She pressed her palms to Marin's face through the bars. Marin turned his head and tried to speak. Mary Alia, I brought bread. Guards seized her wrists and shoved her away. The archivist recorded the interruption and the names. He wrote Elia twice to mark the attempt. His pen moved in short strokes while his hands trembled. That tremor was the archivist's only outward admission that the spectacle had crossed a line he recognized. A scribe carrying a municipal roll stepped under the lantern light to read aloud the mayoral ledger that authorized public displays. He read the legal language. Deterrent, civic order, exemplary punishment. A cluster of small notations followed each authorization, names circled, repeat offenders highlighted. The archivist read the notations again in the margin and found a pattern. Several names were annotated with the same magistrate's initials. He set the ledger on the table and tapped the initials with his fingernail. The discovery flipped his shame into something sharper. Suspicion. Scribe, where did these initials come from? The archivist, fingers on the paper. The scribe blinked and said, they were added at the clerk's desk last month. The archivist frowned, then asked, which clerk? The scribe named Thomas, a clerk who answered directly to the magistrate. The archivist wrote Thomas's name in the ledger and closed his pen. He felt the first clear direction. This was not random cruelty, but a procedure with a signature. The crowd's murmurs climbed as torches guttered in the breeze. The herald beat the staff again. The magistrate read the names of Marin's offenses in a flat voice and then stepped back. The crowd shifted between curiosity and calculation. Men kicked at the cobbles, women folded their hands. A young apprentice spat on the ground and muttered, let them see him rot. The archivist wrote that phrase down in quotation marks. He recorded who said it and where that person stood. He recorded the crowd's distribution and the faces that turned away. Every observation was a concrete item he could point to later when he tried to prove pattern and intent. At the platform's edge, a clerk from the municipal office whispered to the magistrate. The magistrate's jaw tightened. We cannot leave him long. The magistrate in a low voice, the ledger gives us room for 2 nights. Keep it. Enough terror. The archivist wrote this exchange word for word. His hand moved quicker now. He had shifted from shame to controlled resolve. The discovery of the initials had changed his role from passive recorder to a man who might assemble evidence. Night swallowed the square. Torches tilted and cast faces into knife-edge shadow. The executioner pulled Marin's chin up and slammed the iron collar into place. Marin hissed and coughed. Marin Elia cried, look at me. Marin's lips moved. The words did not reach past the bars. The executioner tightened straps and stamped the padlock shut. The crowd foreman ordered silence. The herald raised his staff. The chain clinked as the winch began to lift the cage onto the platform. From the archivist's tent beside the square, he found the ledger again and compared the newly added numbers to the older pages. The old entries showed similar phrasing and the same initials beside names listed as troublemakers. He read aloud to the scribe, look here, May 2nd, June 14th, October 10th. The scribe leaned in, then cursed softly. Thomas altered these. The scribe. Thomas signed them when he was supposed to be filing reports. The archivist put his finger beneath the ink and felt the grain of the paper. He had moved from suspicion to evidence. The ledger gave him proof of pattern. A man from the crowd, Intervanner, shoved through with a scrap of paper in his hand and called out, you cover crimes with iron and call them law. Guards seized him before he reached the dais. Scuffle broke out, stop him! The herald yelled. The crowd surged. The archivist set the ledger down and stepped forward. Let him speak, he said, and his voice was steady. Guards closed on him instead and pushed him back toward his tent. The intervention turned the ritual into conflict. The magistrate signaled the winch to lift the cage higher, a deliberate act to restore order through display. As the cage rose, Marin's knees buckled and a guard shoved a blanket into the bars to muffle the noise. The archivist watched Marin press his forehead to the iron. Marin's breath came in short bursts. The family member Elia screamed a single, sustained sound that pierced the crowd. Around them, some looked away and some stared with mouths open. The archivist kept recording names and responses in a terse script. He noted who cheered, who left, who wept. The ledger took the spectacle apart until it read like a municipal ledger of choices. When the cage reached its final height, the magistrate ordered the crowd dispersed. The herald repeated the decree. Men stepped back. The archivist closed the ledger and marked the time. He wrote, "Cage hoisted, crowd dispersed, 1 intervention, 1 wounded guard." He set a small cross by Marin's name to show the family had protested. The archivist felt the record's weight pressing on him. The ledger was becoming an accusation in its own right. At night, in the archivist's tent, the scribe brought a lamp and a list of previous displays. They mimic each other. The scribe, same targets, same intervals. The archivist read the names aloud and found common occupations: tailors, a schoolmaster, a wool seller who had argued over taxation. He tapped the margin where the same magistrate's initials repeated. "This is not deterrent only." The archivist, "This is selection." He wrote the word and then crossed it out, preferring the evidence to the label. He recorded Thomas's shifts at the clerk's desk and the magistrate's voice ordering shorter durations when protests rose. By midnight, a small group of townspeople waited near the platform, murmuring and trading details. The archivist approached the crowd foreman and asked who led the cheer when the cage rose. The crowd foreman spat and said simply, "Old trades." They wanted a warning. The archivist noted the trades and the times. He felt an emotional shift again, from controlled resolve into a low, petrified clarity. The city used shame not only to teach but to choose who would be branded in public. The next event came at the scribe's table when the magistrate sent Thomas to review the ledger's entries. Thomas moved with practiced indifference. The archivist watched Thomas's hands hover over the pages, then remove a sheet and slide a fresh page into place. A clerk in the corner noticed and called out, "Thomas, what are you doing?" Thomas snapped, "Updating records." The clerk backed down. The archivist recorded the exchange and wrote Thomas's name with the date and time. He felt the ledger's pages press into evidence, and he felt the need to act on that record, steady as the pen in his hand. A second mini cliffhanger unfolded when the archivist slipped a marked page into his satchel and left the tent. Walking toward the square, he saw a guard strike intervener across the face and drag him away. The archivist stopped them and said, "Release him." "You have no warrant." The guards laughed and pushed him aside. The archive's presence had become a threat to the officials. That public pushback escalated the danger and forced the archivist to decide whether to move his ledger to safety or to leave it as proof in his charge. At dawn, the empty square held only the swinging iron cage and scattered straw. A single gull landed on a nearby roof and pecked at a leftover scrap of bread. The archivist returned to the platform, lifted the ledger and opened to the night's entries. He added the new marginal notes and underlined Thomas's name twice. He wrote the phrase "selective spectacle" next to the magistrate's initials and then drew a thin line. A scribe approached and whispered, "You will be blamed for stirring the pot." The archivist's hand did not stop. He turned the page and wrote the next line. "File for review, copy to counter, keep originals at archive." That concrete order was his plan for how to force institutional attention. Elia came alone at dawn, her hair damp from rain, and placed a folded cloth on the ledger's corner. "Marin left this on the way here." "Elia, he wanted me to fold it into the record." She touched the page and looked at the archivist. "Do you know his father's name?" she asked. The archivist read the ledger aloud and found a name he had not expected. Marin was the son of a former municipal rope maker who had argued the tax rolls 5 years earlier. The archivist wrote that connection down. The ledger revealed a motive beyond law. Old disputes resurfaced in public punishment. The magistrate arrived with 2 attendants and stood a few paces away while the archivist wrote. The magistrate quietly, "You will keep an accurate record, archivist." The archivist looked up and said, "I will record what I see." The magistrate's eyes hardened and he turned away. The archivist closed the ledger and decided to copy relevant pages and send them to the county clerk as he had written. That decision moved him from chronicler to active challenger. His shame had pushed him from quiet observer into a role that risked retaliation. At mid-morning, the archivist sealed copied pages and handed them to the scribe for delivery. The scribe hesitated, then took them. "If they burn these, we have witnesses." The scribe, "If they burn nothing, we still have names." The archivist nodded. He added another entry: "Witnesses arranged, copies dispatched." The scribe left with the bundle. The archivist watched the scribe walk into a narrow lane where the magistrate's men sometimes loitered. He felt a distant fear press against his chest but kept his fingers on the ledger and continued to mark what choices had been made. By noon, the square showed the mark of the night's spectacle: small clumps of straw, trampled cloak hems, and the faint smear of rust where the cage had hung. The archivist recorded each of those details because they were evidence of time and place. He glanced at the ledger where he had circled several other names and found a pattern emerging like plotted points. The municipal display had a logic. The magistrate's initials, Thomas's alterations, selected professions, and a final control tactic the winch used during interventions. He underlined the winch notation and added the scribe's note. Intervention suppressed by hoisting. That line bridged action to motive. Late afternoon, the magistrate called for the ledger. 2 guards approached the archivist with outstretched hands. Hand it over, the magistrate. The archivist set the ledger on the table and pushed back. I will not yield originals, he answered. The magistrate's face went still. You force my hand. The magistrate. File a complaint if you must. The archivist returned the magistrate's stare and kept one hand on the ledger. He would not give up the primary source. That refusal was a small victory and a clear pivot. The archivist had chosen to protect his record rather than protect his position. When the magistrate left, Thomas lingered by the tent and hissed, "You are making enemies," the archivist replied. "The ledger shows choices." "I must save it." Thomas's shoulders hardened. "You will be accused of falsifying pages." "Thomas, you will lose your post." The archivist felt the old shame rise for a moment. An inheritance of fear about losing public trust, then let it fall away. He packed the ledger into a chest and carried it behind a false panel in his study. He locked the panel with a brass key and set the key on a chain around his neck. The archivist had converted shame into a guarded action. At dusk the square was empty, but the iron cage still cast a long shadow across the market stalls. The archivist sat at his desk and wrote the final line for the night. Copy delivered to county clerk, original secured. Witnesses listed. He closed the ledger, checked the signatures he had collected, and stepped to the window to watch the cage swing once in the wind. He felt a slow, worn resignation in his shoulders and the hard satisfaction of an action completed. Before he put out the lamp, the scribe returned and handed him a slip. "They tried to set fire to the lane where I walked." The scribe. "They failed." The archivist read the slip and added the new detail to his records. He set the lamp down and stood, hearing the square's empty echoes. He slid the ledger back into the hidden chest and locked it. He left the chest under the false panel and walked out to the square to verify the empty cage himself. The final image of the night was a close inspection. A rusted loop where the padlock had been, a strip of cloth caught on one iron bar, and a small smear of blood on Marin's cuff where the guard's hand had pressed too hard. The archivist photographed the cuff with a small brass camera and then turned back to the ledger. He placed the photograph between the pages and wrote one last concrete order: preserve cuff sample. Sent to county examiner. He sealed the ledger and filed it into the archive under a new label. The archivist then locked the archive door and left the key in the medallion chain at his throat. The cage swung once more over the square as dawn began to bruise the horizon. In the morning, as the first light caught the iron, the archivist closed the ledger, circled a new name, and set the book back on its shelf as the empty cage swung once over the cobbles. He left a note on the table. Next step, county review. He placed the key into his pocket, walked down the lane, and handed the scribe a sealed copy for safekeeping. Outside, the magistrate's men were already arguing over who would clean the platform. The archivist walked away without looking back and kept his silence as the city prepared to put one more name onto the municipal list. A wheel snapped in the cobbles and the iron teeth of the cage bit wood. A single raw sound from inside stopped the murmurs in the square. The archivist's fingers tightened around his ledger and he moved his pen as if it might steady the city's pulse. Suspicion sat behind his ribs and guided the small movements of his hands. He did not look away from the cage. Within the first minutes, the central problem was clear. The city had turned a body into a lesson. The archivist had watched Marin's shoulders press against rusted bars in the last light. He had felt shame when the crowd laughed at the sound and the guards made a show of lifting their spears. Suspicion drove him to watch the officials more closely than the prisoner. Every formal line of the decree promised necessity. Every informal gesture hinted at arrangement. The archivist was a man of records, not applause. He kept the ledger open between two brass weights. He slid his spectacles down to the tip of his nose and traced the decree's wording with a fingertip while the magistrate climbed the platform. He listened for precise phrasing, for any legal caveat that would justify public exposure for a person who could not speak his defense. Suspicion tightened his jaw further when the magistrate's voice read the sentence in a practiced cadence. The magistrate announced the hours and the provisions. Marin shall remain on display until harvest's end or until a confession is recorded. The magistrate. Voice rounded for ceremony. The body shall answer for the offense in view of the populace. Guards adjusted rope where the cage met the cart. A child laughed once and then stopped when a soldier's elbow found his ribs. Elena pushed through the edge of the crowd before the magistrate finished. "Magistrate, you have no right," she called. Her voice carried. It cut the platform's formality into pieces. She shoved at a guard and said the name. "Marin is my brother." The guard tightened a gauntleted hand and shoved her back. She grabbed at the cage iron and the soldier hauled her from the bar. "Elena!" The archivist allowed, stepping forward. His pen paused over the ledger. The first emotional shift arrived in a scrape and an accusation. The archivist's suspicion slid into a cold, steady anger that he held in measured gestures. He did not shout. He wrote the magistrate's words into the margin with a small, deliberate stroke. The ledger's paper took ink the way facts take weight. He recorded the time, the exact phrase used, the number of guards. He recorded Elena's name and the way the soldier's glove tore at her sleeve. A guard barked a command. Captain Rowan leaned in close to the magistrate and spoke too quietly for most to hear. The magistrate's mouth tightened. The guard stepped outward, forming a ring that rewrote the crowd's route. The archivist watched Rowan's shoulders make a small, deliberate motion toward the cart. He felt suspicion deepen into something sharper, the sense that what was being performed had a designer. The child near the cage, Tom, pointed and shouted, "That's Master Beldy's boy!" The name moved through the crowd like a loose stone. Murmurs swelled and then pressed into a single, heavy sound. Faces that had watched with detached curiosity turned into faces that remembered the household beyond the market lane. The magistrate's tone shifted. His reading slowed and the practiced cadence scraped. Tension rose. A trader in the front row muttered. Beldy would never let his son steal. Two women exchanged looks and then pressed forward to see the prisoner better. The archivist's hand found the ledger's inner margin and brushed a small note he had once made in passing. See prior accusations P. Hun 31. He flipped the page with a careful thumb. He found a marginal entry that had not been there that morning. The ink was still a fraction damp at the edge. The sentence read in a clerk's narrow hand, accepted accusation, reward promised. The archivist's posture changed in the sort of way that could be described as a physical decision. He placed both palms flat on the ledger and rose from his seat. He had crossed from observer to actor. He stepped toward the magistrate and the platform. Magistrate, he said, keeping his voice low but carrying, the ledger records a payment on this charge. The magistrate's lips thinned. You will not halt civic order for clerical errors, the magistrate. His voice pulled at the crowd's attention because he shaped it to the public ear. Alina screamed a single line from where guards had shoved her to the dirt. You bought this! She spat. You bought the accusation and you hang my brother for those coins? The crowd stuttered as if learning when it could be shocked. A man near the back shouted, Show us proof! Another voice said, If it's bought, then why would you display him? A second emotional shift occurred in rapid succession. The archivist's anger curved into doubt. If the marginal note was true, then the public arrangement had purpose beyond punishment. It was manipulation. But doubt tightened to procedure in the archivist. He had a ledger to prove, entries to cross-reference, names to cite. He opened the ledger fully, the pages fanning like flat stone. Captain Rowan stepped closer and whispered a single, clipped sentence to the magistrate. The magistrate's jaw worked. This is not the time for papers, he murmured back. His public voice rose immediately to cover the private exchange. The guards moved again to widen the gap. The archivist ignored their shadow and read aloud, voice steady, ledger, entry on this morning. Accepted accusation. Reward promised. Signed, Thomas Beldy Steward. He looked toward the market lane where Beldy's household stood. The name struck like a physical thing. A merchant near the gate swayed. Someone in the crowd began to chant, not from malice but from the new shape of facts. Beldy! Beldy, answer! Voices multiplied until they were an instrument. Marin pressed his face to the iron and made another small sound that might have been a name. Leveled on both palms from the scuffle, lifted her chin and said nothing. Three men in the magistrate's inner circle muttered and exchanged short, urgent lines. The archivist's ledger now sat open between the magistrate and the crowd. The magistrate's eyes flicked to it and then away. He barked in order for the guards to hold the square still. No one leaves. He commanded, the display will continue as decreed. No interference. The command had the brittle quality of a made thing. The crowd bristled. The archivist took a breath and stepped to the platform edge. He did not speak to inflame. He read a line from the margin, precise and unembellished. This entry lists a reward given to a steward on behalf of Thomas Beldy. The ledger records a payment. Silence grew like a press. Elena sobbed once and then stopped, jaw clenched. The magistrate's face showed only the technique of authority. It did not show answers. An external event shifted the scene again. A guard reached out to seize the ledger. His leather fingers closed on the ledger's corner. The archivist moved quicker. He slapped his palm down over the guard's hand, and the contact made the sort of sound a joint makes when it meets resistance. Do not touch public records. The archivist. He planted himself between the ledger and the crowd as if the book were fragile and alive. The guards hesitated. Captain Rowan's voice cut like metal. Archivist, step back. This is a civic proceeding, the archivist. The ledger is part of the civic proceeding. The exchange was terse and legal and immediate. 3 lines of argumented back and forth unfolded in the air. The crowd leaned in. The magistrate's jaw tightened and his fingers sought the chain of a pocket watch. Tom, the child, shouted a half question and then a name. What did you do, Marin? Marin sounded raw through the bars and could not respond clearly. Elena moved to the front again and placed her hands flat on the cold iron. I will not let them teach fear with my brother. Her voice carried a demand that made several people in the crowd glance away as if they had been singled out. The magistrate tried to reclaim the stage. Order, he said, order for the good of the city. Elena spat. For whose good? For those who pay. 2 guards shoved forward and the crowd braced. The archivist felt the pressure of the square pressing decisions at his back. He had moved from suspicion to anger to doubt. Now the feeling that shaped him was resolve. He had a ledger entry and a margin note. He had a role that, by duty, required him to place facts in plain view. The crowd grew restless. Someone threw a small stone that pinged off the cart's wheel. It did not hit a person, but it broke the sequence of commands and countermoves. The magistrate's face reddened. He ordered the cage raised a hand's breadth higher on the cart. The guards adjusted ropes, the hoist creaked. The archivist felt the chain of the ledger's weight like a decision being handed to him. He set the ledger on the platform rail and opened it to the page with the fresh ink. He read the clerk's note aloud, slowly and without flourish. Accepted accusation. Reward promised. Signed by Steward of Thomas Beldy. He pointed at the handwriting and carried the eye of the crowd to it. Here is the record. Here is the payment. His voice did not waver. The crowd bent towards the ink as if it could pull answers from the page. The magistrate snapped. You cannot interrupt a sentence after it is pronounced. The archivist answered with a single, calm line. I will not disrupt the sentence. I will expose the reason it was spoken. Alina screamed the word, bought, again, and the square split between those who sought punishment and those who wanted proof. A man near the back shouted, expose it then? The demand turned toward the magistrate with sharp teeth, a mid-chapter mini cliffhanger. From the shadowed edge of the platform a hand slipped a folded paper into the magistrate's palm and withdrew. The movement was small enough that some missed it and small enough to matter. The magistrate's face tightened. Captain Rowan looked at the magistrate and then at the archivist with a look that asked one private question. Will you stop? The crowd hummed like a kettle on a low flame. The archivist's next choice made the chapter tilt. He slammed the ledger open to the incriminating entry in a move that sounded like a gavel. Pages fanned and the sound snapped attention. He read the clerk's name aloud and then read the official line that accompanied it. This accusation was recorded and expedited at the steward's petition, he said. I record that the process was irregular. The word irregular settled like dust in the square. 3 rapid exchanges followed between magistrate and archivist, short lines that pushed and pulled the day's story. Archivist, remove that language. The magistrate ordered no. The archivist replied, the record will show what was written. You impeach the court in public. The magistrate shot back, I report the ledger. Nothing more. You will not silence this paper. The archivist. Guards tightened their formation. Elena's breath came hard. A twist unfolded that changed how the crowd and the officials understood earlier actions. A voice in the back called out, Beldy pays the steward salt for votes. The name had been murmured earlier. Now someone gave it the weight of fact. The trader who had once vouched for Beldy stepped forward and said, I saw the steward leave the house with coins at dawn. The square shifted under a new gravity. The magistrate's authority lost some of its sheen. Merrin pressed to the bars, made another incomprehensible sound, and then, faintly, his lips formed a word. Not, he could not finish before a guard cuffed him. The archivist watched Merrin's wrists and how they released a small scrap of cloth. Alina snatched the cloth and found a scrap of a servant's token. She held it up and shouted, this is from Beldy's steward. The object became a concrete proof in the hands of a relative. Captain Rowan barked orders to seal the square and call for witnesses to be detained. The magistrate tried to retain control by issuing a formal reading about procedure. The archivist replied by transcribing the formal reading into the ledger and then appending the marginal note about payment. He did not add commentary, only precise notes of what had occurred and who had said it. When the magistrate ordered the cage hoisted higher, the crowd's moods split into anger and fear. The archivist closed the ledger and stood with it pressed to his chest. He had chosen to expose the entry. The choice had not freed Merrin, had put the city's choices on record. Alina turned to the archivist and said, you held the page open, you saw what they tried to hide. He nodded once and did not speak. The aftermath was quick and weathered. Guards moved through the crowd and began to disperse people by name, calling out market sellers and household servants who had come with the cart. The magistrate barked orders to remove the cart at dawn. Captain Rowan took notes that he did not read aloud. The archivist walked back to his table at the square's edge with the ledger under his arm. He sat and began with small precise strokes to inscribe the day's events into a new margin entry. Time, names, facts. The final paragraph closes on a concrete beat. As the square emptied and the cage hung like a mute sign above wet cobbles, there came a sharp knock on the archive door. The archivist paused with his pen above the page, then rose and opened the door to find Captain Rowan waiting, hand wrapped around an envelope stamped with the magistrate's seal. Rowan did not smile. We need to speak about what you wrote. The archivist lifted the ledger and stepped back into the lamplight to show the pages where ink held the city's small, stubborn truth. The archivist slammed the ledger onto the council table and said, this is not ad hoc cruelty. This is policy. Suspicion tightened his throat as he pushed the book toward the magistrate and let the heavy brass watch fall onto the oak. He had come straight from the square. He had heard the cart jolted and the iron teeth scrape the stones, and Merrin had made a single raw sound into the dusk. That memory sat in his jaw and drove him across the hall. The central problem was immediate and public. The city had begun treating humiliation as law. The archivist wanted the council to read the entries and to face what they had ordered. He believed the ledger held proof. Suspicion led him to confront them. He would not let the book sit unexamined. He did not wait for permission. He pushed back the shutters and let the late night cold cut the candle flames. The magistrate looked up from his papers as if he had been waiting for trouble. The clerk tightened his grip on a quill and nodded once at the ledger. The archivist kept his hands visible. He set the leather-bound book open to the margin notes he had traced a dozen times in his study. His fingers smudged ink on the page. He did not care. He spoke plainly. Read this entry. The Archivist, the cage is not a punishment improvised. It is written as a program. He tapped a cramped line where a faint hand had added. Retain for display. Rotate weekly. Public notice. The magistrate's jaw moved, but he did not speak. The clerk read the line aloud, voice level, precise. A retain for display. The clerk read rotate weekly. He the words in a clerk's rhythm. As if inventorying grain, he underlined the line with the quill and set the tip against his lip. His face had the tight stillness of someone watching a fire. The archive room smelled of old paper and candle soot. The candle's color was dim gold against the magistrate's dark coat. The archivist's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the tremor of anger he gave permission to show. He placed a second piece of paper on the table, a smeared courier note and a strip of cloth with dried blood. This came from the cart, he said. From the square, the clerk looked at the smear. The magistrate's hand twitched toward the watch pocket in his coat. The room held a different sort of noise. The faint metallic echo of the city's evening bells and the long, thin breath of a man about to decide. Emotion shifted in the room. Suspicion turned to pressure. The archivist used short, sharp sentences. He read aloud ledger entries that named the cage and scheduled its public hoisting. He read the municipal decree drafts that used maintenance language to hide intent. Each aloud line pulled the magistrate's face into smaller shapes. At one point the magistrate spoke. You say these are errors, Archivist. The magistrate, they are not errors, magistrate. They are orders. The archivist pointed to a second marginal note. Withhold shelter exposed to weather. He did not look away when he said it. The clerk muttered a sound low in his throat and pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose. A tension of policy versus conscience took shape. The magistrate's voice stayed measured, the cadence of a man trained to navigate complaints and petitions. We keep order, Archivist. The square is for teaching the public what will not be tolerated. He folded a paper and tapped the seal impression on his table with a knuckle. Tell me plainly. Are you accusing this hall of deliberate cruelty? The archivist answered with the ledger and with the cart driver's cloth. He described the cart jolting over the same cobbles the magistrate's carriage used, the iron teeth sounding like a machine biting wood. He Marin's name and the raw sound that had halted the square. He repeated the line from a witness note. He cannot stand the sun. He vomited twice. He kept the speech clipped, each clause a factual strike. When he described the square's odor, wet straw, gutted torches, saw bread, he did so only to place a reader in a concrete scene, not to soften the accusation. The magistrate's eyes hardened. Marin, the magistrate, Marin the baker's son. Yes, Marin, the one who cursed the foreman's cart last week. The one who refused to pay the watch fee. The archivist's voice did not rise, his hand did. He flipped the ledger to a line that listed names linked to display and example. Marin's name sat between two others with neat strokes. The clerk swallowed. The magistrate shifted his posture and spoke too quickly. If the people see us recanting, if we appear weak, they will break more windows, take more bread. He set his palm on the ledger as if to weigh it down. Order is costly. The cage costs less than patrols. Order costs lives. The archivist, Marin, is failing. The cart driver brought a note. He drools. He coughs. The bars rip his skin. Footsteps sounded along the corridor. Someone tapped at the outer door and then entered with a wet cloak and ragged breath. The cart driver stood there, coat clotted with mud. He leaned on the frame like a man who had given his strength to one more delivery. The archivist rose and walked to him. Driver, tell them what you saw. The archivist. The driver wiped his hands on his cloak. I tied the ropes wrong once. The Marin hit his head on the iron. We wrapped his mouth before the crowd. They me to go back. I wrote it down. I gave it to the clerk at dawn. His voice was raw. He named Marin's complaint. Hunger, thirst, the blistering cold that came off the iron at night. The crowd had cheered when the cage turned, and that a man in the first row had spat when Marin's knuckles bled. The clerk scribbled the driver's words. He pronounced them into the room and then paused. The pause lasted a steady beat too long. The archivist read the clerk's face as if it were a map. The clerk's lips tightened. His finger hovered over ink. The clerk cleared his throat and asked the magistrate a halting question. Magistrate, whose order authorized the rotation schedule? The magistrate's hand slowed. He looked at the clerk and then at the archivist. He did not answer immediately. Outside, the city clock threw a deep, dull chime. The clerk leaned forward. We have a written instruction, your seal, and a secondary note in the margin that matches your shortened magistrate. Who signed this? The magistrate's eyes darted toward the shutter and away. He placed his fingers over his mouth for a moment and exhaled. I signed a draft to restrict loitering and to set penalties. The rest was left to enforcement. I did not imagine this. He made the only claim a man like him could make, surprise at consequences. His voice had the brittle edge of a man trying to reshape truth into accident. That claim did not settle the room. The archivist lifted another page. The marginalia traced notched instructions and a list of names. The ledger revealed a hidden motive. Beside the rotation dates, a short phrase had been added in a different ink in a different hand. It read, "Purge dissenters, maintain order." The archivist pointed. The clerk's eyes widened. The magistrate paled. This is not ours. The magistrate then who wrote the line? The archivist. The clerk looked down and then, in a voice that lost its clerkly steadiness, named a name that had not been present in the hall before. Your deputy, Thomas. He has been handling the petitions and the late-night requests. He has the shortened, the new reveal changed the room, the twist rearranged blame. The archivist had expected to expose only policy. Instead, he uncovered a patron behind the cage who had a ledger row marked for political insurance. The clerk added, Thomas argued at meetings for visible deterrence. It would keep the guilds in line. The magistrate's hands trembled. He moved to a locked drawer and removed a sealed draft. The seal was stamped, but the ink was faint. He held the paper as if it were a living thing. Thomas took authority in my absence. Thomas wrote the rotation as a way to frighten dissenters aligned with the baker's gang. He sent a note last week asking me to allow the display. I signed in error. His voice broke on the last word as if the error could be measured and contained by speech. A new emotion took root in the archivist. Anger that tasted like a decision. He felt betrayal sharpening to clarity. He stood and set his palms on the table so his ring dented the leather cover. Magistrate, Thomas used your name to put people on the scaffold list. This was not about bread. This was about the guild's complaints. This was political. He the last word, slowly letting it land. The clerk's hand found his spectacles and cleaned them with the corner of a ledger page. He nothing for a beat and then asked, will you name him magistrate? Will you revoke the displays? The magistrate swallowed. He knew the hall's public face could not look indecisive. He also knew the foreman of townspeople had been summoned and would arrive at dawn to press for the cage's continuation. The archivist watched him make a calculation. He noticed the magistrate's knuckles press ghost dents into the decree paper. The man's features shuffled between conscience and image, and for the first time the archivist did not believe in accidental ink. Someone shouted at the hall steps. A delegation arrived earlier than expected. A foreman and 3 laborers from the markets, muddy in earnest. They crowded onto the steps and demanded to be heard. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Joran, stepped forward and said, Magistrate, we need the lesson. Keep the cage, keep the peace. The watch costs too much. This is cheaper. This is what people understand. He pointed to the street as if the whole city were listening. Joran's arrival changed the immediate arithmetic. The magistrate's jaw set. The archivist, a terse question. Archivist, if we revoke the order, will the people riot? The archivist knew how to answer with paper and with fact. He them about the cart driver and Marin's note. He read aloud a witness fragment from the square that described Marin's collapse when the cage had swung and the crowd had cheered. He watched the faces in the hall when the bread thieves' names were listed beside civic fines and when the name Marin was shown in a column marked example. Each reading made the magistrate smaller. The debate tightened into a confrontation. The foreman named security. The clerk cited custom and cost. The archivist described what he had seen and smelled. Voices overlapped. The magistrate listened to the bargaining of men who measured threat in coin and convenience. Joran, the magistrate, finally, will this end dissent or only make it cleverer? Joran spat. It ends shouting in the square. It keeps the stalls open. And Marin, the archivist, does Marin's body count as an acceptable price? Silence opened and then shrank. The clerk pushed his spectacles higher and said, Magistrate, if we remove the displays, the foreman will fund patrols. They promised. They will pay, then pay now. The archivist, write the patrols into the budget. I will record it. The sentence not as a bargain, but as an ultimatum. The room hummed with the noise of men doing math in their heads. The magistrate hesitated. He lifted a signet ring from his finger and set it above the ledger. He picked up the draft decree and thumbed the wax. His hand shook and then steadied as if by force of will. He dipped the ring into the sealing wax and pressed. The wax gave and the seal left its black impression. He signed the name and then stamped the wax with the ring. The clerks in the hall let out a sound like someone who had been holding their breath. The archivist read the signature with flat eyes, but the decision was not the end, it was the turning point. The clerk passed the seal to the archivist and said that the decree ordered the cage to be hoisted immediately and to remain public. The archivist stared at the stamped paper. He had hoped for revocation. The magistrate, pressed by the delegation and fearful of unrest, had chosen security over mercy. The archivist felt the shift move within him. Anger curdled into a slow, deliberate grief. The archivist had a ledger obligation and a moral one. He had the authority to record the decree as it was verbatim, stamped and sealed. He also held a pen and the margins of his book. The clerk's hand brushed the inkwell as if to take the pen and write the exact language. The archivist's fingers hovered over the margin where he might add clarifying notes. He thought of Marin in the cage, the cart jolting, the iron teeth. He thought of the driver's rag and the smear of dried blood. He felt his pulse in his throat and made the decision he had weighed since the cart had scraped the stones. He altered the margins. The act was small. A single insertion in a cramped script that matched no hand in the hall, a line noting political enforcement beside the rotation schedule, and a cross, reference to the courier's note and to Thomas's name. He signed the marginal note with his initials. He made the ink darker and slightly smeared the corner as if from haste. He did not announce what he had done. He wrote the truth and hid the truth in the place people least expected to look, the ledger's side notes. He then closed the book a fraction and slid it back toward the magistrate. The clerks did not notice at once. The clerk in the room read the main decree aloud as the magistrate required, the cage to be hoisted and the display to remain. The foreman nodded and prepared to carry the news to the square. The driver who had told his truth dipped his head and left. Marin's name would be seen again at morning. The archivist stood in the doorway when the first light creased the shutters. He watched the cart crossing the square in memory and then in new proof. The cage would be raised and Marin would be exed to morning sun and to the cries of a crowd that wanted a visible lesson. The archivist knew his marginalia would not save Marin that morning. He also knew that records could outlive men. He had doctored the ledger not to erase wrongdoing but to record it in a way that could be found by those who later looked more carefully. He imagined a future clerk reading the margin and tracing names back to Thomas and to the foreman. A small surprise followed the climax. The clerk who had argued for rote copying confided in the archivist as people gathered to leave. He whispered, "I will keep the clerk's notes hidden in my chest. I cannot bear the thought of being the ink that covers a name." The archivist slid a folded strip of paper into the clerk's hand, a duplicate of the marginal note. The clerk pressed it to his vest and nodded. This act meant another person had chosen to carry the risk. It changed the balance of culpability. At noon, the square filled with the same sound the archivist had heard before. The cart's teeth, the crowd's hush, and a single voice from within the cage like a wounded instrument. Marin's ribs rose in short, laboring breaths. He looked hollowed and his eyes found the magistrate's balcony twice. The foreman walked the line between men and law, and the crowd's faces hardened when Marin stumbled inside the iron lattice. The magistrate watched and did not interfere. The clerk who kept the duplicate notes stood at the hall and watched the crowd. He folded his hands around a scrap and kept his face blank. The archivist returned to his alcove later that day. He set the ledger open on his desk and checked the margin where his hand had written the truth. The ink had dried. The smear he had left to mimic haste still showed. He closed the book with the same slow hand he had used in the chamber. He felt the mechanics of his choice, the weight of each page, the dent his thumb made in the leather, the trace of ink on his finger. He thought of Marin's name and of the magistrate stamping the wax. He thought of the clerk who had agreed to hide a duplicate. He thought of Thomas and of the delegation that had chosen order. He put the brass watch back into his pocket and locked the ledger into the chest. He did not write a final line praising his action. He did not add an explanation. He left the record to be found by those who knew how to look. Outside, the square empty, the cage cast a long shadow over damp cobbles, and a torn strip of cloth swung from a spike. The magistrate retreated into the hall and closed the door behind him. The archivist closed the ledger with a slow hand and left the margins changed. The seal on the decree caught the light as the hall door shut.